Welcome to the Dibley Diaries this week. It's pouring with rain again, so I'm actually sitting in a church porch, which is quite a nice light place to film, but it's dry, so we're sitting here. This week, in the Thought of the Day, we're going to be thinking about the passage in Matthew, where Jesus talks about forgiveness and being kind and being non-judgmental. The Church of England and the Church in general doesn't necessarily have a good record on these things. I know there's all sorts of things which can be a legal problem about it, and where we can be perceived not to be kind. So the things when we have to follow legal rules for things about marriages and about burials, and sometimes people have accused the church in the past of not being very kind about those things, but actually if they're legal things then we can't break those. But I think there are many more situations where people have felt judged, they've felt that they couldn't come in and seek forgiveness of a church community, they couldn't be part of what was going on because they didn't feel that maybe the people in the church community were going to be kind to them. Just wanted to think about a couple of examples of church communities being very kind. One of the places where I worked not all that long ago had a little larder in a large village community, and it was just in the church porch in a cupboard, and it had some food, it had some toiletries, it had some household items, and if you needed something you could just come and get it. Porch door wasn't locked, the outside porch gate wasn't locked, you could come in and just get what you needed. And I was really proud of the church community there at showing this kindness to the community. There was no judgment about it. I mean, we could do bigger referrals to food banks and so on, but people could just come and get something that they needed from the little larder. And that was one of the ways where we were trying to be kind to our community. And one of the other places I worked, volunteered 20 years ago was a food bank, but it didn't have any referral schemes, it didn't have anything. You just turn up and we'd give you a bag of food. And at the time I worked there, the bags of food cost about £2.50. And people would say to me, well, how do you know that these people really need the food? How do you know that they're not just coming to get free food from you and they could pay for it? Or how do you know that actually they're not wasting their other money when that they could have spent on food on other things? And I just used to think, well, if anyone's going to come and queue up for £2.50 worth of food, I want to give them that food. I want to be kind to them because I want to show kindness in that way, in the way that Jesus always encouraged us to be kind. Thought for the week this week is based on our passage in Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 to 35, and we're continuing that journey through Matthew. And we find Jesus and Peter having a discussion. So Peter starts the discussion by asking Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive a member of the church? And Jesus tells this story, and I find it confusing in this story that Jesus used the word slave, or the word in the NRSV is translated as slave, even though this person, slave or servant, is someone who clearly has money and possessions and is free to trade. But the NRSV does translate this word slave, but a slave who has possessions, and other slaves do have possessions and debts and accounts. So the story begins that Jesus is telling in the answer to this question, how many times should I forgive someone? Jesus says there was once a lord, and he was calling his slaves to account, and he called in his most senior slave who had a really large debt to him, and the slave couldn't pay it, and so the Lord was going to be really cross with him and put him in prison or do whatever he was going to do, and the slave begged for mercy, and the Lord was merciful to him. The slave then goes home and calls in a debt from another slave, which is not as big a debt, it's just a smaller debt, but when the slave of the person who's been forgiven their debts can't pay, then the slave who'd been forgiven is really cruel and doesn't forgive that person's debt at all, and throws them into prison and all this sort of thing. And then when the main lord, hears about it, he summons the first slave and is really cross with him and punishes him for not showing mercy and kindness in the way that the Lord in this story had shown kindness. And Jesus is telling this story, remember, in answer to Peter's question about forgiveness. How many times should I forgive someone who sins against me? So there's this great big discussion and all these things about what does it mean for us to be merciful and to be kind and show forgiveness. And Jesus is saying that we need to be merciful and kind and show forgiveness in the way that God shows forgiveness to us. So that's what Jesus is saying here. The church over the centuries has not had a reputation for being kind or showing mercy necessarily. In fact, there are many people who feel hurt by the actions of the church. Some of these are very complicated actions and they're to do with legal restrictions, why we might not perhaps have been allowed to have someone marry in the church building, which then someone perceives that as unkind and so on. But there have also been lots of instances where people have justified not showing kindness or forgiveness from a theological stance. That isn't what Jesus is about. Jesus is saying this is how you should forgive. You should forgive generously as God forgives generously. And so we find ourselves in this situation, and Peter and Jesus have had this bit of a tumultuous relationship in the readings we've been following through Matthew. And Peter finds himself in this position where he says to Jesus, how many times should I forgive someone? And Jesus is having to forgive Peter all the time, and he will need to forgive Peter again as we move to the events around the crucifixion and the resurrection, and Jesus meeting them, having breakfast at the shore. So we should forgive in a generous way, in the way that God has forgiven us, and we should love and be kind in that way. For the Dibley moment for this week, I wanted to talk about a time when someone was really kind to me in the village where we lived. So I had a friend from who lived in a large town staying with me, and we realised that the fridge was broken. It just wasn't keeping anything cool anymore, and so I'm like, well, it's quite late, so we'll sort something out about this tomorrow, but I'm just going to put on the village Facebook page that I'm in need of a fridge and see what happens. And so I put on the village Facebook page, my fridge is broken, if anyone's got a fridge we could borrow for a bit, that would be fantastic. And about 15 minutes later, a white van pulled into our drive, and it was moderately late at night, and my friend said to me, why is there a van? Are you expecting a delivery? And I'm like, I don't know, but I suspect it could be a fridge. And she looked at me in that kind of mad woman sort of, where do you live sort of way. And yes, it was one of our friends who'd seen my post on Facebook and just brought us a fridge round in their van, and I was so grateful to them, and it was real kindness. And this person who lived in a larger town hadn't kind of clocked that that's often how villages work. So super thank you for the person who turned up at my door with a fridge that evening, and just thank you for their kindness to us on that occasion. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week and a week full of kindness.